Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at, well, a really huge piece of legislation. It's one that seems set to fundamentally change how the U.S. handles immigration. We're talking about potentially massive ripple effects across society. It's not just about the money, though there's a lot of it. It's about redefining national priorities. We're diving into H.R. 1, officially called the Big Beautiful Bill Act. Quite a title, right?
You've certainly got attention.
It's a new budget reconciliation bill.
Yeah.
That's, a specific way they can pass budget-related things in the Senate with just a simple majority. It just passed the Senate July 1st, 2025. It had already gone through the House back in May. So our mission today, unpack the key parts, especially this, frankly, unprecedented spending on immigration enforcement and what that might mean for undocumented immigrants and, well, everyone else.
Right. And to help you understand this, we've looked at quite a bit of analysis. We're drawing on reports and critiques from groups like the American Immigration Council, the Cato Institute, the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, and also the government's own projections think Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, and the White House. So we're aiming for a balanced picture for you.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
It's definitely sparked conversation, and the numbers alone are pretty astounding. Let's start there. With the scale of the funding, it's just huge. H.R. 1 puts about $170 billion specifically towards immigration and border enforcement. And it's really crucial to get this. This isn't instead of existing money. It's on top of it. The U.S. was already planning to spend around $34 billion for fiscal year 2025. So add H.R. 1, and you're looking at almost $200 billion available starting this year.
Yeah, $200 billion. And to really get how massive that is, think about this. Even before this new bill, that $34 billion for immigration enforcement, it was already more than double the money for all other federal law enforcement agencies put together.
Double. Wow, like FBI, DEA.
Exactly. FBI, DEA, Secret Service, ATF, the main DOJ budget, parts of DHS. All of them combined got less than half of what immigration enforcement already had. Now, with H.R. 1, immigration and border enforcement funding, it's going to be something like 87% of all federal spending on law enforcement.
87%.
That's
That's not a tweak, that's a total realignment.
It really is. An almost unbelievable shift in where the money's going.
So just to put some clear numbers on that for you listening, H.R. 1 means immigration gets roughly $200 billion. Compare that to all those other big agencies combined, FBI, DEA, Secret Service, Justice, Homeland Security. Generally, their total is only about $16 billion.
Right. The difference is enormous. It's hard to even compare. And there's something else here. Economists sometimes talk about inertia. When you build such a vast infrastructure, for detention, for enforcement, it creates its own pressure. You've got the buildings, the staff. There's this built-in momentum to keep it running at high capacity to justify the expense.
So you mean even if migration numbers change, the system itself kind of pushes for more detentions, more deportations?
That's the concern, yes. It could lock in a kind of punitive approach for decades, making enforcement the default almost regardless of the situation on the ground. And it could also mean enforcement spreads much further inland, into communities far from the border that maybe weren't the main focus before.
That's a really sobering point about locking in an approach long term. So with this huge funding shift, the obvious question is, what does this all mean in terms of specific actions and changes we're likely to see?
Okay, let's break down where the money's actually going. First, a really massive expansion of detention capacity. We're talking $45 billion for new ICE detention centers. And that includes facilities specifically for families.
$45 billion just for new detention centers.
Just for new ones. To put that in perspective, it's a 265% jump from ICE's current detention budget. And get this, it's 62% larger than the entire budget for the federal prison system.
Larger than the Bureau of Prisons budget.
Larger. The projections suggest this allows for detaining at least 116,000 non-citizens every single day, with the capacity to hold maybe up to 200,000 people at once. That's like detaining the entire population of, say, Salt Lake City, Utah. Every day.
That's staggering.
And CBP, Customs and Border Protection, they get $5 billion for their own detention facilities, too. That's expected to triple their current capacity, which is around 12,000. Plus, there's this provision, and it's raising eyebrows. It lets the Secretary of Homeland Security set minimum detention standards for facilities holding single adults, kind of bypassing the usual review process. Critics worry this could really benefit private prison companies.
So The big picture here seems to be making detention a central pillar, maybe
Yeah.
the central pillar of immigration control, not just a temporary thing.
Exactly. Establishing it as a primary tool for control, for deterrence, not just a step in the process. And that could, genuinely pressure people to just give up on their legal claims if they're facing potentially years locked up.
Right, that pressure is immense. So, detention capacity is exploding. What about direct enforcement?
Right.
Deportations. How's ICE's actual operational budget changing?
It's getting a huge boost as well. $29.9 billion is specifically earmarked for ICE enforcement and deportation operations. That basically triples ICE's current yearly budget.
Triples it.
Yep. By 2028, ICE's total budget could triple. Their ERO division, that's enforcement and removal operations, their budget could almost quadruple. And the specific funding line for transportation and removal, the actual deportation flights and logistics, that goes up 5 times.
Five-fold increase there.
Plus, the bill mandates hiring at least 10,000 new ICE agents. That would more than double the current number of ERO agents out there.
Okay, more agents, way more money for removals. What's the expected outcome?
The projection is a 5-fold increase in deportations, getting up over 1 million per year. And the administration itself has used the phrase mass removal campaign. That language strongly suggests a very proactive, very aggressive strategy, not just reacting at the border, but actively looking for people inside the country, too.
1 million deportations a year?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the border wall. That's always a hot topic. Is it getting funded here, too?
Oh, yes. A very significant amount. $46.6 billion specifically for border wall construction.
How does that compare to, say, previous spending?
It's more than 3 times what the Trump administration spent on the wall in its entire first term. And, groups like the American Immigration Council point out that past wall spending hasn't really led to major improvements in how the border is managed overall.
So it raises an important question, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to think about. Is this huge investment more about politics, about symbols, than about practical results? And could that money be used differently, perhaps more effectively or humanely?
That's exactly the debate surrounding it.
Okay, so we have detention, ICE operations, the wall. Are there other broader pots of money, maybe more flexible funds for DHS or CBP?
Yes, there are. There's a new $10 billion fund created for DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. The stated purpose is broad: safeguard U.S. borders. But the analysis highlights there are very few safeguards and little guidance tied to it. That $10 billion is almost half of CBP's entire budget from FY 2024.
Half their budget in one new flexible fund.
Pretty much. The concern is it could effectively become a discretionary slush fund, mostly for CBP. On top of that, there's money for at least 8,500 new CBP agents. That includes 3,000 specifically for Border Patrol. And another $3.4 billion is allocated to support state and local law enforcement getting involved in immigration enforcement.
More local police involvement.
Yes, and groups like the ACLU raise serious flags about that. They worry about the potential for abuse of power, less oversight compared to federal agents, increased racial profiling, and violations of civil rights when local police take on immigration duties.
It really paints a picture of enforcement being ramped up across the board. But what about the other side of the equation, the courts? If you're arresting and detaining way more people, what's happening with the immigration judicial system?
This is where it gets really concerning, I think. According to the analysis, it's a stark contrast. The House version of the bill actually proposed a decent funding increase for the immigration court's EOIR, the Executive Office for Immigration Review. About $1.3 billion, a 30% increase.
Okay, that sounds somewhat logical if enforcement is increasing.
Right. But the final Senate version, it lumps the EOIR funding into a bigger pot for the Department of Justice, about $3.3 billion total for various things. And crucially, it caps the number of immigration judges at 800.
800. How many are there now?
Around 700. So it's only a very small increase in judges.
So, massive increase in arrests and detentions, but barely any more judges to handle the cases.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here, or maybe disturbing, is how this looks like it could be a deliberate strategy. You overwhelm the courts, the backlogs, which are already huge, will just explode. Detained people will wait months, maybe longer, for a hearing. Non-detained people, even longer. Years.
Yeah, the likely result is
People give up, they waive their rights, agree to be deported just to get out of detention or end the uncertainty. It fundamentally undermines due process.
wow, okay. And one last piece, impacting immigrants directly: fees. Are there changes to application costs?
Yes, significant ones. Across the board, really. There's a new $100 fee just to apply for asylum.
A fee for asylum, that's new.
Brand new. Then $550 for your first work permit application. And $100 every year just to keep your application pending if it's delayed. There's also a new $250 visa bond for people coming on non-immigrant visas. Think temporary visitors, students, workers, totally different from green cards. And you only get that bond back if you comply perfectly with all visa terms.
So potentially getting tourists, students?
Yeah, potentially. All these new fees could add up to $65 billion in revenue, according to projections. The sources we looked at consistently describe these fees as costly and prohibitive. The expectation is they'll block many people from accessing legal status pathways.
Which leads to?
More deportations or more people leaving under pressure, those voluntary departures we mentioned, which often aren't really voluntary. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's creating a clear economic barrier. Access to the legal immigration system becomes much more dependent on whether you have money. It essentially turns it into a privilege, pushing more people into the shadows or forcing them out.
Okay. So we've covered the enormous funding shift and the specific ways it's being spent: detention, ICE, wall, courts, fees. Let's pivot now to the consequences. What does this all mean for you, the listener, and for the fabric of society? Beyond the policy details, what are the real-world repercussions likely to be?
Well, the most immediate and obvious is the projected surge in detentions and deportations. As we said, over 1 million deportations a year, plus maybe 500,000 voluntary departures. The impact on undocumented individuals and their families will be direct and devastating. We're talking about a massive increase in family separations, communities destabilized.
And the ripple effects of that.
It's a cascade, really. Chronic stress, serious mental health impacts, both for those directly affected and their families, including U.S. citizen children, deepening distrust of police, schools, hospitals. Basically, any public institution, you see the breakdown of essential family and community support networks. This has long-term consequences for public health, for education outcomes, for social cohesion overall.
And what about basic needs like healthcare? Access to services? How does the bill affect that? It's already a minefield in the U.S.
It is, and this bill adds another layer of complexity and, frankly, hardship. One of the most alarming estimates from the source materials is that somewhere between 12 and 17 million people could be at risk of losing healthcare coverage because of this.
12 to 17 million. How?
It's complicated. Undocumented immigrants are already mostly barred from federal programs like Medicaid or getting subsidies through the ACA marketplaces. But this bill goes further, hitting legally present immigrants too.
People who are here legally.
Yeah.
Like refugees.
Yes. For example, legally present immigrants who have humanitarian protections, refugees, asylum seekers, trafficking victims. They could potentially lose access to things like SNAP food assistance, Medicare, ACA tax credits, even federal student aid for college. Even some long-term legal permanent residents, people who've worked and paid taxes for over 10 years, could lose Medicare access under certain provisions.
Wow.
And there's another piece. The bill cuts back federal Medicaid reimbursements to states, specifically states that have chosen to use their own funds to cover health care for some legally present adults or even undocumented immigrants.
So states that tried to fill the gap might lose federal money.
Exactly, which could force them to cut those programs, leading to huge losses in coverage. And this raises a really important question for you listening. When you restrict healthcare access for millions, what does that do? It obviously worsens health inequality, but doesn't it also risk wider public health? Untreated illnesses don't exactly respect immigration status.
That's a critical point. Beyond the immense human cost, what about the economic and fiscal side? This level of spending must have major financial implications.
Absolutely. It's not just the upfront costs. The Cato Institute, for instance, ran some numbers. They estimate that removing 8.7 million undocumented immigrants over 5 years, which seems to be the scale implied by the mass removal goal, could actually increase the national debt by around $900 billion.
Increase the debt.
Costs of enforcement, detention, removal, plus the lost economic activity and tax revenue from those removed. And Cato suggests that figure could double if this level of enforcement funding becomes permanent. Think about it. The projected cost of immigration enforcement under H.R. 1 could swallow up the entire budget for all other federal law enforcement for 10 years.
10 years worth of FBI, DEA, all of it.
That's the comparison drawn. And the Congressional Budget Office itself projects H.R. 1 will add $2.4 trillion to the federal debt over 10 years. And that projection doesn't even include interest payments or the full economic costs of mass deportation.
$2.4 trillion added debt.
Plus, there's a projected 15% decrease in legal immigration. Why? Because the harsh environment might deter people and potential sponsors might be scared off. That's a significant loss of human capital, innovation, economic contributions. What's fascinating, or perhaps concerning, here's the discussion in these analyses about the sheer fiscal cost and the waste of human potential. It really contrasts this massive spending on punishment with what might be a more pragmatic, maybe even economically beneficial approach to immigration. The worry is this path could seriously dampen long-term economic growth.
And finally, let's circle back to the human rights and due process concerns that organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch keep raising. How does this bill stack up against those principles?
Not well, according to those groups. They reiterate long-standing documented problems with immigration detention, arbitrary lockups, inhumane conditions, and a fundamental lack of due process. Think about the practical barriers inside detention. Limited or no access to lawyers, inadequate medical care, problems just understanding the proceedings due to language barriers, even delays getting phone calls or mail. All of this makes it incredibly hard for someone to actually fight their case from behind bars.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this whole approach increasingly treats immigration, which is technically a civil matter, like it's a criminal issue. You have people who haven't committed serious crimes being held in jail-like facilities, sometimes for very long periods. And when you combine that with the underfunded courts and the high fees that make legal help or waiver applications unaffordable, well, the argument is that it effectively denies people a meaningful chance to present their case. It undermines fundamental principles of justice and the rule of law that we generally expect.
So let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground. The core finding seems to be that H.R. 1 is this truly unprecedented, almost radical shift in U.S. government spending. Nearly $200 billion focused squarely on immigration enforcement.
Right. And the strategy outlined in the bill, and echoed by the administration's language, is clearly centered on mass removal. It's about deterrence through large-scale detention and deportation. The analysis suggests it prioritizes things that look like action political symbols, maybe speed over strategies with proven effectiveness, and certainly over robust due process. And that imbalance between funding enforcement versus funding the courts is just stark.
And the potential consequences we've discussed are huge. Widespread family separation, millions potentially losing health care, a massive economic burden, and serious questions about human rights and basic fairness.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, something based on these projections. What kind of society does this budget really envision for the United States? And what are we as a nation trading off in the long run? How do we balance this particular vision of security against, say, economic vitality or those foundational principles of justice we talked about?
What stands out to you after this deep dive?